Broadcasting from Detroit's Cass Corridor, it's the Metro on WDET. I'm Kerry Jr. II.
And I'm Robyn Vincent. Today on the show, for centuries, people have wrestled with whether science and religion can coexist.
The Vatican's astronomer says they not only can, they can help us see the universe in fuller ways.
Also, the Palisades nuclear plant in southwest Michigan was shut down just 3 years ago, and now it's come back online after decommissioning.
Today, we're looking at what this restart means and asking whether nuclear energy is the climate solution we've been waiting for or a risk we can't afford.
But first, and relatedly, for years, oil and gas companies have pushed the idea that the climate crisis is our fault. They told us to change our light bulbs, recycle more, and drive less, all while they kept pumping and profiting. BP Oil even popularized the carbon footprint calculator. That tool put the spotlight on our daily habits and shifted attention away from the companies driving the crisis.
What size is your carbon footprint?
The carbon footprint, that I don't know.
Whatever it is, the whole population of the world, make that a very, very big number.
How much carbon I produce? Is that it?
You mean the effect that my living has on the earth in terms of the products I consume?
That was a BP ad about our carbon footprint. Now, a new study adds another layer to this story. Researchers found that people often misjudge which personal choices matter most. Many think recycling is the biggest fix, but it's actually cutting down on long flights, eating less meat, and even deciding whether or not to own a dog. That's because pets have surprisingly large carbon footprints. When people were shown the facts, they adjusted their intentions. But there's a catch. When climate action was framed only as a personal checklist, participants were less likely to support big collective steps, like voting for climate policy or joining a march. Now, this tension speaks to the myth of personal responsibility in climate change. Naomi Oreskes has written widely about how industries, from tobacco to oil, push this myth to delay real action. She's a professor of the history of science at Harvard University. Some of her books include Merchants of Doubt and The Big Myth: How American Business Taught Us to Loathe Government and Love the Free Market. She joins us today to discuss how we can shift the focus back to the systemic changes we need to make a dent in the climate crisis. Professor Oreskes, welcome to the Metro.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So, Professor, the idea that climate change is mainly about our personal choices didn't appear out of thin air. PR campaigns and corporate strategy shaped it. Why has this framing, blaming everyday habits instead of fossil fuel production, been such a powerful tool for the industry?
Well, I think it's been powerful primarily because it taps into something that many of us believe in and like, which is the idea that we have autonomy, that we have agency, and that our choices make a difference. And so when the industry says, well, you can solve this problem if you just change your light bulbs or calculate your carbon footprint, that appeals to our sense that we want to be responsible and accountable people. And it's not 100% wrong. What we do as individuals does matter. And I personally think that the answer is both and, because people feel better when they feel that they are taking action that makes a difference. But the problem is when this is misleading, focusing on actions that don't actually make much of a difference, and when it stands in the way of or discourages us from really addressing the systemic factors that keep us using fossil fuels.
Professor, I'm wondering how this kind of framing has influenced politics and policy debates over the decades.
Well, I think we see it's influenced it enormously. As you said in the introduction, I've done a lot of work on the history of tobacco. And one of the strategies the tobacco industry used, one of the powerful strategies, to prevent tobacco control was to focus on personal choice, personal responsibility, and personal freedom, and to say it's really up to the smoker to decide for himself or herself if they want to continue smoking. And again, this has a certain intrinsic appeal. Yeah, I'm a grown-up. I should be able to decide for myself. I don't need the government to tell me how to live my life. But the problem with that argument was twofold. One is that tobacco is an addictive product. So once you're addicted to something, it's not just a question of personal choice or willpower. You're now physiologically addicted to this product. And the tobacco industry not only knew that its product was addictive, but actually worked to make it more addictive. So it's a very misleading argument. And then in addition, we know that what the government does, what policies we set, what terms society sets for the use of products makes a really big difference. The tobacco industry tried to use the narrative of personal choice and personal responsibility to prevent meaningful tobacco control, like banning smoking in public places.
So it sounds like it is and was really about appealing to something that is very American, and that is an idea of rugged individualism.
Exactly. And almost all disinformation campaigns work this way. No one gets up in public and says, I want to kill 8 million people every year, which is what the tobacco industry did. Rather, they say, no, I'm protecting something valuable, freedom, individualism. And again, as we've been discussing already, this really appeals to some deeply held American values, particularly the value of rugged individualism. And this is why we see these sorts of disinformation campaigns much more extensively in the United States than in other countries in the world. And we see they're much more effective here, because if you go to a country, I don't know, like Singapore or even France, Korea, places that have more of a sense of collective responsibility, less individualistic ideology, these sorts of campaigns don't work so well in those countries.
So in collectivist versus individualistic countries, these campaigns, they can take hold more in a very individualistic society like the U.S. Now, I want to look back to the 1990s, if we could, when groups like the American Petroleum Institute pushed both doubt about climate science and consumer demand narratives. I'm wondering how those worked together to stall progress. And would you say, was it more about buying time than winning hearts and minds?
Well, that's a really great question, because I think in the beginning, it really was about buying time. We know that the fossil fuel industry was very well aware already in the 1970s and 80s of the potential for a climate crisis. And I think, based on reading lots and lots of documents, that they did not think they would be as successful as they were in actually completely blocking action. I think they were just trying to buy time. But actually, these strategies worked so well that they have effectively blocked meaningful action, particularly in the United States, but around the world, for decades. So I think they've succeeded beyond what they even imagined and hoped at that time.
Professor, do you see parallels today with, say, the hype around carbon capture or hydrogen?
Well, carbon capture and hydrogen are interesting because both of those are technologies that have the potential to make a difference and contribute to solving the climate crisis. The problem, though, is that neither one exists on the scale that we need right now. And the reason why crisis is the appropriate word to use in 2025 is that climate change is already happening. It's happening rapidly. People are dying in wildfires, heat waves. People are losing, billions of dollars are being lost every year just in the United States alone from climate-driven fires, floods, this sort of thing. So we are in a state of crisis, but these things like carbon capture distract attention. Mm-hmm. And they carbon capture effectively has become yet another subsidy to the fossil fuel industry, that they now can be paid to develop means to store carbon in the ground. And it's not intrinsically false but it's very misleading. And a lot of disinformation works this way. It's not exactly lies, it's things that are misleading, half-truths, give you the wrong impression. So the fossil fuel industry, if you go to their web pages, you'll see claims that give you the impression that carbon capture is a technology that is proven, that works well, and is making a significant difference in the climate crisis. Those are all false. The amount of carbon being stored is minuscule compared to the amount of carbon that is continually being dumped into the atmosphere. And no one has actually proven long-term safe storage. When the fossil fuel industry says this is a proven technology, it's really misleading because it has been proven for something that's known as enhanced oil recovery. And without getting too geeky on you, enhanced oil recovery simply means pumping CO2 into the ground to get more oil and gas out, to get the sticky oil out that would otherwise stay in the ground. That is a proven technology. That makes the climate crisis worse. So they're claiming that this is a proven technology to solve the climate crisis, but it's actually a proven technology that makes the climate crisis worse. So that's a pretty sticky argument.
Yeah. I mean, research shows Exxon has emphasized technology and consumer demand rather than acknowledging its own role. And what you're saying is that this has been a very effective strategy. Related to carbon capture, though, we know that forests do capture and hold carbon. A lot of people say carbon credits are a practical way of working within business and industry to capture carbon. Is that an example, would you say, of good policy, or does it also enable profits and delay effective policy?
The latter. It's not a good policy. And again, it's one of these things that sounds good in principle. It has an intrinsic appeal. I mean, who doesn't like trees, right? But it ends up being a distraction or a deflection from the real issue, which is the need to reduce fossil fuels, to reduce the amount of carbon pollution that we are putting in the atmosphere. The problem with planting trees is twofold, or actually it's three. First of all, you have to plant huge numbers. And so the question is, where are you going to find the land to do that in a world where we also need land for food, for people to live on, to protect biodiversity? And typically the kinds of forests people are talking about, they're monocultures, they're not biodiverse, they don't support an abundance of diverse wildlife or even human recreational activities. Second thing is they take too long to grow. Typically takes about 30 years for most trees to reach maturity. We don't have 30 years to wait. We've got to fix this now. The clock is really ticking. And the third thing is what people call verifiability. So if I plant a bunch of trees today and I get carbon credits for that, how do we know those trees won't be cut down next year, won't burn in a wildfire, won't be chopped down for, sold for paper? So most carbon credit systems don't have adequate mechanisms for ensuring that these forests actually do the work they're supposed to do. And meanwhile, I've taken the credits. I'm laughing all the way to the bank while some other company is cutting down that forest. So it's really a distraction. The core issue in this whole debate is the use of fossil fuels, that when we use them as intended, when we burn them, they put carbon pollution in the atmosphere. That drives the climate crisis. And until we address the core cause, most of these other things we're talking about really are distractions.
This is the Metro on WDET. I'm Robyn Vincent. My guest is Naomi Oreskes, professor of the history of science at Harvard University. She's one of the nation's foremost experts on climate disinformation. We're talking about how the fossil fuel industry created the myth of personal responsibility in the climate crisis. Professor, I want to talk about the new study that I mentioned at the top. It comes from researchers at NYU, Stanford, Copenhagen Business School, and Yale. They found people often overestimate the impact of small steps like recycling, and that we often underestimate the impact of bigger ones like flying less, eating less meat, or even owning a dog. Why is it important to correct these misperceptions?
Well, it's important for a couple of reasons. The first one is what we've already been talking about, which is the distraction. If people think we can solve the climate crisis by recycling, then they're distracted into an activity that may be helpful in other ways. So recycling can be helpful if you live in a place where the landfills are getting full, but they don't address the climate crisis. It's also important. I mean, I really love this paper, and I was very happy when you asked me to talk about it, because there are a lot of people out there these days saying facts don't matter, nobody's listening to evidence, and that is a very discouraging framework.
Yes.
But I think we have a lot of evidence that facts still actually do matter to most people. Not everybody. Some people are just in their boxes and nothing you can say to them will change their mind. But my experience, my personal experience, my experience working with school teachers through the National Center for Science Education is that many people are actually hungry for good information. And when they have good information from trusted sources, they will act on it if they can. And this paper shows that that's true, that when you give people information and they gave it in different forms and they both worked, that many people will adjust their actions and activities. And if they're able to, they will do things that are more effective. Most of us want to be effective. We don't want to waste our time doing stupid things, but we don't always know which are the stupid things and which are the smart things. And this study shows that when you give people that information, it does make a difference. Now, the big caveat is what they refer to as plasticity. That is to say, can you make that change? And so it's also important for us to recognize that some things that could be helpful, like using public transportation, are not actually available to most Americans. And I think this is really important because I've been in places like Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, or even parts of Massachusetts where there just is no good public transportation. So it's no use telling people, oh, use public transportation if that option is not available to them. You have to think about what's effective, but you also have to think about what's available.
Professor, the study also showed that when climate action is framed only as a personal checklist, people were less likely to support collective solutions, like, say, voting for climate policy. Does this risk actually reinforcing the myth of personal responsibility?
I don't think so. I think what you just said is really crucial, and it's what pulls this whole conversation together. The fossil fuel industry, particularly BP with its carbon footprint idea, has deliberately tried to encourage the idea that this is our fault. You mentioned consumer demand a couple of times, that they're just giving us a product that we want. You know, they're just the innocent suppliers of this thing, and it's our fault for demanding it. And so they've tried to focus attention on the carbon footprint, the individual action, because they know that, first of all, if we think it's our fault, then we'll be reluctant to criticize other people, including them, and also that it distracts us from the collective action that in the long run is probably the most essential thing. Because fundamentally, although there are things that individuals can do, and I get asked about this all the time, and I absolutely think we all should do as much as we can as individuals, but there are also things we can't do as individuals. And the example I like to use is, I can change the light bulbs in my house, and that helps a little, but what would really make a difference is if I could change my electricity grid. And that's not something I can do on my own. That is something that I can only do by working together with other people for political and cultural change.
So what you're talking about is framing that helps people connect their personal actions to collective power.
Exactly. And so I think the important thing is to point out it's both and. We're not saying that people shouldn't take steps that would make a difference, particularly food. Food choices make a huge difference, and that's something that we all have agency over. And one thing I always like to point out, and honestly, I've often thought, if there is a God, this is the proof of it, because what's good for us as individuals in terms of food is actually what's good for the planet. Our existing industrial agricultural system is incredibly unhealthy, and it's incredibly bad for the planet and biodiversity. So shifting to a more plant-forward diet is both good for us as individuals and good for society as a whole. And so we can begin to think of this as a both and problem. Yes, we do what we can as individuals, but we also think about the structural issues that have to be changed through political and collective action.
It sounds like you'd like to see journalists and educators and leaders adopting this kind of language, talking about personal action in a way that builds momentum for broader change. Could you give an example of a message or a campaign that has gotten this balance right?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Well, I think Bill McKibben and 350.org has been very good on this point, because one of the things Bill says when you ask him about this individual, because we get this question all the time, what can I as an individual do to fix this problem? And Bill says, don't try to fix it as an individual. And I think that's really smart, because I think it reminds people that because we've been bombarded with these messages of individual responsibility, and because, as we said at the outset, we do live in a culture that emphasizes individual choice and individual freedom, most of us, we go to that individual action first. That's where our instinct takes us. And so I think what's really important is to say, that's not bad. You're not wrong, especially if you change your diet or fly less. I'm drawing the line of the dog thing, and we can talk about that if we want to. But
I think we need to, yes, because
we have to talk about dogs. Okay, let's talk about dogs.
I know for one thing, it upset our senior producer, David Lyons, quite a bit, who is very eco-conscious and has a dog, and was sad to see that part of the study.
Yeah, well, me too. And my dog is on my screensaver on my phone. And, I would argue my dog makes my life better in so many different ways. But this is a reminder that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. So if you love and cherish your dog, then maybe you focus on your travel, or maybe you focus on your food diet. I mean, dogs need to eat meat, but we don't. We can be completely healthy on a vegetarian or even diet, or just a 80-20 solution. Our dogs can't. But the point is, we're all making choices all the time, and that's fine. But then we want to be mindful about those choices and know that, well, if we decide to have a dog or two dogs, then maybe it's time to, cut back on transatlantic flying.
Okay, so it's about trade-offs. I mean, this has me thinking about something else that I feel I need to make a trade-off on, and that's the use of AI, and understanding that AI data centers can be highly polluting entities. And so if I'm using AI, I need to figure out what kind of other trade-offs can I make in my life. So it sounds like this is something we need to be constantly asking ourselves. Is that right?
Yes, and this is a great example of why we need collective action, because did you ever ask for that AI stuff to show up on your computer or your phone?
No.
Suddenly it's there. We didn't ask for it. We didn't demand this. This
Professor?
is not about consumer demand. A lot of the AI stuff out there, in my opinion, is useless. Some of it is false and misleading. But we should be able to choose whether we want this or not. But it's been foisted upon us, and I think foisted is the right word here. It's suddenly there, it's everywhere, and it's causing skyrocketing demand for electricity, which is driving up the price of electricity all over this country, and we're all seeing it in our electricity bills. And it's even leading, as you said, your announcer said at the start of the program, to demands to reopen decommissioned nuclear power plants, which from my perspective is insane. These plants were decommissioned because they were obsolete. They're super expensive to operate. They're dangerous. But here we are, we're being told we have no choice because AI demands it. I mean, AI doesn't demand anything. The companies that run AI are making these demands. And so, I can turn off, I actually recently switched to a different browser on my phone that doesn't do that AI thing. But this is not a problem that can be solved by us as individuals. We need some kind of regulatory framework, some kind of structural framework to say, no, this shouldn't be happening, and we shouldn't be told that we have no choice. I mean, it's really ironic when you think about it. The same people who blather on and on and on about individual freedom, when it suits them, then foist products on us that we don't want and tells us, oh, well, we have no choice but to reopen nuclear power plants.
And actually, that power plant here in Southwest Michigan did just come back online, and we're going to be discussing that a little bit later in the show, the pros and the cons of nuclear energy. But just to make sure I have you on the record about this, you feel that putting these kinds of nuclear facilities back online is a bad idea?
Yes, absolutely. And the thing I like to say about nuclear power is this is a technology with a 70-year history of overpromising and under-delivery. We don't have to speculate. We know. We've tried for 70 years to make this technology work well, and it just doesn't. It's the most expensive form of electricity generation. It generates dangerous and toxic waste, which in 70 years we have still not figured out a good solution for. We have no repository in the United States for nuclear waste from civilian power plants. And people don't like it, and yet it's being foisted upon us. So again, it speaks to this hypocrisy in this whole system, that while the fossil fuel and other industries go on and on and on about personal responsibility, personal choice, at key moments they deny us the choice that we actually want about many very important issues.
Professor Oreskes, before we zoom out, I want to stay focused for one more moment on Michigan. We have a long-standing legal battle between the state of Michigan and a company called Enbridge. It's a Canadian oil company, about the so-called Line 5 tunnel that goes under the Straits of Mackinac. And there are well-organized groups that have long been opposing the line. They're trying to solve the problem together, and the governor has filed a lawsuit against the company to try and stop it as well. That is stalled in the courts. Thus far, the line is still open, and the federal government has not intervened to shut down the line. And certainly under the Trump administration, we do not expect that to be the case. But all of this has me wondering, are there recent examples of collective action against fossil fuel companies that have succeeded?
Well, that's a great question. And I'd say we're kind of in the process. So all across the world, there are over 130 lawsuits now that are being brought against the fossil fuel industry for different kinds of charges. And there have been some important successes. In the Netherlands, a court ruled that Royal Dutch Shell has to take steps to reduce its production of carbon pollution. And a big win at the International Court of Justice just a few weeks ago in a case that I submitted an expert report for, saying that the nations of the world that produce large amounts of carbon pollution have to take steps to get that under control, or they could be sued by island nation states like Vanuatu, who are suffering the consequences of the actions of the wealthy large polluters. So we are beginning to see courts step up to the plate to affirm the legitimacy of some of these legal claims. It's still early days. The problem with legal action is it's very, very slow, and meanwhile, CO2 is just building and building and building. We're also seeing some personal injury suits being brought, for example, in the state of Oregon, related to the heat dome that killed over 200 people and thousands or tens of thousands of livestock. So we are seeing collective action beginning, and I think protests are important because they raise awareness about these issues, but we need to do much, much more. We're really behind the 8 ball. So much of my work in my books that you mentioned is really about how scientists have been studying this problem seriously and in a detailed, dedicated way since the 1950s. So that's, Dave Killing started measuring CO2 in the atmosphere in 1958. That's 1958, 66 years ago, pushing 67. So, we've really wasted a lot of time. And that's why I get upset about, things like carbon capture and hydrogen, which are not intrinsically bad, but in this crucial moment are really distractions from the main event. And the other thing I would say, as you mentioned my book, so in my new book with Eric Conway, The Big Myth, we show how this idea of individualism has been used by corporate America for 100 years to distract attention away from the harms of their products and activities and convince us we don't need government action, we don't need regulation, but we do need regulation. For markets to work well, we have to have rules of the road that protect people from the damages that certain kinds of products can produce.
This is the Metro on WDET. I'm Robyn Vincent. My guest is Naomi Oreskes, professor of the history of science at Harvard University. She's one of the nation's foremost experts on climate disinformation. We're talking about how the fossil fuel industry created the myth of personal responsibility in the climate crisis. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll discuss what big systemic changes need to happen now to save people and the planet. This is the Metro on WDET. RT. I'm Robyn Vincent. We're talking about how the fossil fuel industry created the myth of personal responsibility in the climate crisis. My guest is Naomi Oreskes, professor of the history of science at Harvard University. She's one of the nation's experts on climate disinformation. Professor, you mentioned earlier in the conversation that corporations have actually prevented clean energy movements and projects from taking root by putting the ownership of carbon outputs on individuals. Could you give us some examples of that?
Well, the most important example is taking place even as we speak, and that's Revolution Wind in Rhode Island. So that's a big offshore wind project. Offshore wind is one of the most efficient ways that we can generate electricity, especially in the densely populated urban Northeast. This project is nearly finished. It was scheduled to start producing electricity this coming year, and the Trump administration has stopped it. And there is no plausible economic or scientific or cultural justification for stopping this project. And yet there it is. It's ready to roll. The other thing we're seeing is, and this relates to the misinformation question we've been talking about, many people think that renewable energy is very expensive and that it's very heavily subsidized. And so that comes a reason not to want to support it. But the reality is that it's actually cheaper than fossil fuels and far cheaper than nuclear power. So right now in most parts of the world and most parts of the United States, renewable energy is the most cost competitive means of generating electricity. But that's not what most people think. And so a lot of people are sympathetic to this idea that we need to reopen nuclear power plants, thinking that somehow that will save us money, when the opposite is true. And the only explanation for this is that the fossil fuel industry is so influencing our government, particularly under the present administration, but it was true in many previous administrations as well, that our government continues to subsidize fossil fuels, is now actively blocking renewables, even though it's a better choice both financially, scientifically, and in terms of our health.
So in other words, it feels like we're taking many rapid steps backwards. I want to focus a little bit on accountability. Oil companies have moved from denial to greenwashing, and that is the practice of misleading people into thinking they're more environmentally responsible than they really are, something we've been touching on this entire conversation. It's essentially a marketing spin to highlight small green gestures while hiding or downplaying the bigger harms of their core business. So, for example, an oil company running ads about planting trees while it's expanding drilling. So, Professor Oreskes, which tools, journalism, lawsuits, regulation, are most effective at holding them accountable right now?
Well, I think all of the above. I mean, as we said already, lawsuits are a little problematic because they take a long time, but they also call attention to these issues about dishonesty and lack of accountability. So I think lawsuits are really important, especially if they get press coverage. And sometimes I've talked to people in the media who say, okay, well, let me know when it goes to court. And then I really try to persuade them that that's not the right approach, that we should be talking about these lawsuits because of the way in which they're highlighting and providing proof of industry malfeasance, in my opinion. So I think that's important, but I think it's also really important for people to be working on more immediate and short-term things. So in Rhode Island, for example, I mean, the people of Rhode Island should be protesting about this, right? They should be, and I know the Rhode Island senators are obviously on this issue, but supporting their elected representatives to say, no, this is ridiculous. We've invested in this wind power project. It's going to be good for the state and we want it. So I think that's important. And then just talking about the issue. One of the really terrible things that has happened in this country in the last decade or so, because the fossil fuel industry and its allies have so effectively polarized us on this issue, many of us who don't necessarily have strong feelings about it, we don't even want to talk about it. It feels too divisive. We don't want to break up friendships over these issues. And so we just don't talk about it. And my postdoc and I, Sasha Korov, we have a paper, it's about to come out on this issue. So climate change obviously affects everyone, but we know from previous polling work that people who are religious believers and attend church regularly are more likely to reject the science than, Americans at large. So yet there have been religious leaders, most notably Pope Francis, also the Patriarch Bartholomew, who have spoken out on this issue and have said climate change is a religious issue, and particularly it's a Christian issue. So we thought it would be interesting to see, well, what are Christian ministers saying in church when they give their sermons on Sunday about this issue? So we downloaded over 1 million sermons off the internet to see what people were saying, particularly Catholic churches, after the Pope had spoken out on the issue. And the answer was nothing. There is essentially no conversation taking place in American Christianity about this issue. And that's just heartbreak and a giant missed opportunity, because when we don't talk about it, then we can't figure out what the right steps would be to address it. And it's particularly ironic after the devastating floods in Texas, where those young girls were at a Christian camp and they were completely unprepared. The camp was completely unprepared to deal with the flooding that occurred, in part because no one was talking about it. And so just talking about the issue, doing what we're doing here right now, it's probably the single most important thing we can do as individuals.
In other words, climate change is touching absolutely everything, and we have to view it in this intersectional way. Before I let you go, Professor Oreskes, if you could rewrite the climate narrative in one sentence, what would it be?
You mean the narrative in terms of making people understand the problem?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's about human suffering. You know, I've been saying this to my colleagues for years. Stop talking about parts per million carbon dioxide. People don't know what that means. People don't have any sense of what carbon dioxide even is, but people understand human suffering. The climate change, the climate crisis is about preventing suffering, protecting people from floods that kill people like the floods in Texas, from fires that have destroyed homes in California, from heat waves that killed people in Portland, Oregon. This is about us. It's about human life and also about biodiversity, also about our dogs. You know, in my book, The Collapse of Western Civilization, I have a section in which there's massive dying of cats and dogs, especially dogs, because they're very heat sensitive. That was the single thing in my book that got the most reaction, when the dogs died, you know? So this is about protecting us and the things around us that we love. And I think that message, sort of the positive message of care for our fellow human being and care for the life that we share on this planet. And if you're a religious person, we can talk about caring for God's creation. That's the positive message that I think we need to get across. We're doing this because we care about our fellow human beings and our fellow
We'll have to leave it right there.
Yeah.
Naomi Oreskes, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on the show.
Up next, the Palisades nuclear plant in southwest Michigan has returned to operational status. We'll explore the pros and cons of nuclear energy next.